Join us today as we speak with Vesta Svendsen. Hello everyone, joining us today is Vesta Svendsen, who is a master's candidate at Yeshiva University's Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She's graduating in spring 2024 and is writing her master's thesis on Brest, Belarus, and its radical depopulation from 1937 to 1941. Vesta is looking at the ways that neighbor violence, displacement, totalitarian occupations, deportations, and genocide irreparably severed community bonds in the town and obliterated generational memory, fitting it into Soviet and now Russian mythology of the Second World War. Vesta got her bachelor's degree from Tulane University, and she majored in Russian studies and minored in political science and business, completing coursework in human rights and the Middle East. During summer 2023, Vesta was a summer grad research fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she has traveled for research to Israel, Lithuania, and Poland within the last year. She helmed the Yeshiva University, Vilnius University, Holocaust in Lithuania speaker series as a Fish Center student fellow. As an interviewer for the USC Shoah Visual History Archive, she interviews Russian-speaking Holocaust survivors, and she's translating 2 Russian-language Holocaust memoirs. Born in the former USSR, Vesta was raised between Belarus and the United States. Vesta, thank you so much for being on with us. I really, really appreciate it. Vesta, what you're studying has so much relation to what is happening right now. And that's why we're having you on, because we want to relate the past with what's happening. It's not nice to say that history repeats itself, but sometimes it kind of does, you know? You are a Holocaust student. So let's start with framing what the Holocaust is. What, in the most simplistic terms, can you describe what the Holocaust is and its significance to the Jewish people, specifically how it looms in the memory of Jews today?
Absolutely. Yes. So the Holocaust, the dates of the Holocaust are kind of, it depends on which standpoint you're coming from. Most people think of the Holocaust as the annihilation of 6 million Jews, among other minority groups that were targeted. And it occurred from 1939 to 1935. Some people put the dates at Adolf Hitler's ascendancy in 1933. But the point is that it was a time in throughout Europe in which Jews and other groups were targeted for annihilation. And the reason why it's so important in Jewish memory, it's the greatest disaster. You know, Jews think back to the destruction of the temple, but in the modern, I guess, you know, in the last millennia, this was the greatest destruction of the Jewish people to occur, and it also resulted in the survivors searching for a safe place to go. And because the countries where they had previously found safety were the places where they were targeted, and because they were not able to find safety or stability after the Second World War, they a large proportion of Jews were able to find safety in countries throughout the world, but especially in Israel. And, you know, the Zionism, which is the belief that Jews need a state, a government, governing institutions to protect them. They need to be citizens of a Jewish state. That idea came up well before the Holocaust, especially at the end of the 19th century. But after the Holocaust, that was just a very visceral realization that a Jewish state was needed, both to the survivors and to a larger proportion of the world around them.
Vesta, thank you so much. It leads me to a question. Israel was founded to protect Jews. And what we saw on October 7th is a sort of, the promise was broken there. Can you explain from a Jewish mindset, you're not living in Israel, but you're a Jewish person, how does that affect you, seeing that terrorists could infiltrate Israel and kill 1,400 Jews, rape, torture, murder, and kidnap 222 Israelis and take them into Gaza? How does that make you feel now with that idea of Israel supposing to be a safe haven for Jews?
Well, not only am I a Jew myself, but I am a Jew from the Soviet Union, and Jews were not allowed to immigrate to Israel for quite a long period of time. They were discriminated against in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. You know, these are often people that just kind of barely survived the Holocaust. They were not really allowed to be Jews, but even if they didn't really practice Judaism, obviously they were sort of marked ethnically as Jews, and they were restricted in a variety of ways. So for a lot of them, as they immigrated to Israel, as that opportunity was open to them, that was their first chance to find equality in any sense. Now, for Holocaust survivors, a great deal of them languished in displaced persons camps after the war and waited around to be allowed into Israel. A lot of them came into Israel on these, shoddy shipping vessels, some of which sank. It was very dangerous. So it was very much seen as a safe haven because finally there is a government, there is an army, there are institutions. There have been numerous wars that Israel has had with its neighbors, invasions, things like that, and Israel has prevailed. And so going there as a Jew within the last year, it's a little bit surreal, and I will say it's a very, very complex, very nuanced place. And I think it's difficult to talk about Israel until you go there. But I will say that as a Jew, it feels different. For the first time, you are in a place where most people around you are Jews. You're not a minority. You're not the odd one out. You can be you can express your Judaism in your own multitude of ways. And there is a feeling of safety in that, especially as a Jew who studies the Holocaust, a situation where Jews were targeted through the destruction of government structures, through the dispossession of citizenship, things like that. The more they were not protected by the states that they lived in, the more vulnerable they became. That really emphasizes the need for a place to go, even if as a Jew you choose to live elsewhere, you identify with other countries. Having that place is important. And as a Holocaust scholar, I personally feel the need for multiple passports, because we don't really know what's going to happen in our world. And so it does feel like a huge affront. It feels it's devastating. You know, it's devastating from a human standpoint. It's devastating as a mother, as a wife, as, the child of a Jewish family. It's horrifying to see from the human standpoint. But from the failure of government institutions and structures to protect its citizens, it's even more terrifying because if we think of this as a place to go in times of vulnerability, well, here it is incredibly, incredibly vulnerable with people landing in these situations. And yeah, it definitely strikes at the heart of Jews everywhere, whether or not they've even been to Israel.
Thanks for sharing that, Vesta. Really good answer. There have been a lot now. The Holocaust ended 75 years ago, roughly, right? There have been accusations leveled against Jews and against Israel that it relies on the Holocaust for sympathy. As a Holocaust educator, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think that there are certain contexts and paradigms that are really, really important just because even if people don't know the entire history of why things are the way they are, that history influences people. It influences their decisions. It also influences the emotions around things, the motivations that people may have, and the way that they interpret certain events. So, for Jews, for instance, an act of violence like this that hits them in their own homes, that targets civilians specifically, contextually, it does feel like harkening back to a history that we thought we had moved past, that we thought that we were safe from. And I think if you don't understand that from an emotional standpoint, I think that you might miss some of the human element of the tragedy. There have been Holocaust survivor. I believe that there's at least one Holocaust survivor among the kidnapped. I know that there's a Holocaust educator among the kidnapped. A lot of the people among the kidnapped, among the dead, are, children, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And the thing is, while I don't like the idea of saying that, yes, the Holocaust was devastating, but the Jews, were able to establish Israel as a result. I don't like that because I think that it puts the dead into a position of being martyrs that they never chose to be. Um, there's nothing to make up for the death of 6 million people, 1.5 million children, but at the same time, it it did spur the world to see violence against minorities, to see genocide, to define genocide as a very real thing. And I think that if we don't see the patterns, if we don't see the patterns for, things that predate huge acts of violence, things that, preclude neighbor violence, if we don't look at the conditions, then we kind of fall into these things blind. So I don't know that sympathy is really quite the right word. I think that it's more context that is important. And I think that knowing about the Holocaust in this particular situation is important because of context.
That's really beautifully said, Vesta. It's really about context. You can't understand or use it as a sympathy plea, which is what some people accuse Israel of, but it really is Israel trying to contextualize that history. And we can't talk about the Holocaust without getting to the root of what caused the Holocaust, which is the idea of anti Semitism. And for some of our viewers, they may have not ever heard this word. Could you explain to us what anti Semitism is and maybe a short synopsis of how it fueled the Holocaust?
Sure, absolutely. So anti-Semitism is really just the dehumanization of Jewish people and of Judaism as a religion. It is anti-Judaism. It's a dislike, a disavowal of that, and it can manifest in different ways. So in the 19th century, the form of nation states, before nations were they were ruled by kings, they were ruled by nobility, their borders were a little bit more loose. As nation states kind of consolidated, as entities where people were defined by borders and by citizenships, Jews increasingly began to gain citizenship in various nations throughout Europe. And as they began to gain citizenship, they began to gain rights in constitutions and things like that, and they became more visible in society. They weren't just a segment of the population that lives over there, but they might suddenly be in positions of leadership. And that sort of social change, as in many, many times of social change, it sparked a backlash. Anti-Semitism has been around for many, many years. I mean, for millennia, just as racism has been in various forms. But in this particular context, because Jews became more visible in positions in which they had not been, some of these urges toward violence were ways of groups of people who maybe felt aggrieved, trying to return to a way of life that felt normal to them. So basically, they were taking their own personal anxiety at the state of the world, at the way that the world is changing, and manifesting that on a big scale through acts of violence, through protests, through intimidation, through maybe lobbying for legislation that limited Jewish rights. So that was all the context of the 20 of before the 20th century. With the First World War, there were plenty of Jews that were in armies on both sides. They were citizens, but there was a great deal of upheaval as with the Russian Revolution. There was a civil war in Ukraine. It displaced a great deal of Jews who were very poor. And a lot of these groups, they were facing ethnic violence. They were accused by every side of collaborating with the other side. And so they moved. Populations move when they cannot find food, they can't find safety, they gradually move towards Central Europe. And a lot of them ended up in Austria, in Germany, and they were very visible. They were poor. When we think about, say, Syrian refugees today, being very visible on the streets of Europe, they're in positions where they've lost their entire livelihoods. And they were very different from the society that existed there. We think about, when we look at the numbers of people that were killed in the Holocaust, generally speaking, the further east you go, the larger the numbers get. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of Western countries over time, before they gave Jews citizenship rights in the 19th century, they had already edged out their Jews in a variety of ways. They had either legally expelled them or they prevented them from having economic opportunities. So over time, Jews had kind of moved from Western Europe to Eastern Europe to gain relative stability. And as the economic situation after World War I was difficult, there was a great deal more antipathy toward these refugees that were very visible. I specifically tend to look at Poland and what is today Belarus, also Lithuania, kind of like the post-Soviet satellite countries. And there, they first tried to build a government. Poland had not been its own nation. And they first tried to build a government after World War I. They had a minorities treaty that guaranteed rights to minorities. At the time, Poles, ethnic Poles, Catholic Poles, they were about 60% of the population. And frankly, they didn't know how to have a democracy. And as the Polish economy struggled, as the world economy struggled in the Great Depression, a lot of this woe was channeled at minorities. And that's when various forms of anti-Semitism, whether it was saying that, Jews killed Christ from the religious standpoint, whether it's old myths, like for instance, saying that Jews, steal Christian children and use their blood, silly things like that, or whether it's restricting the amount of Jews that could enter universities, restricting Jews' economic opportunities by not giving them licenses to work in certain professions or to open certain businesses. Then it turned into economic boycotts of saying, well, Christians shouldn't do business with Jews. And in some cases, some of the violence and destruction was actually against Christians who were doing business with Jews to just intimidate them and prevent them. It's some of the same stuff that we've actually seen in the South after, uh, before the civil rights movement, some of the pressures against social change. All of this is anxiety against social change in which groups of minorities are gaining greater legal rights, greater economic rights, more visibility in a society, and people who have a problem with that for a variety of reasons, them reacting. And so that's kind of how anti-Semitism arose. And it just gradually, in a lot of these countries, was a slow creep of dehumanization. You would have anti-Semitic slogans that suddenly became okay for politicians to say. You would have the idea of getting the Jews out of society, pushing them to leave, becoming more and more acceptable as a way of fixing the economy. You would have boycotts that would become more and more acceptable. Just this gradual dehumanization kind of wore away at the sympathies and the community bonds that existed in that society that protected minorities. So, in short, anti-Semitism is an antipathy for the Jewish people. It's the othering of Jewish people on a variety of bases, but that's kind of how it led into the conditions for the Holocaust.
Vesta, thank you so much for explaining that. It really is the othering of Jews, and we're seeing that happening on a global scale right now as this conflict has galvanized opinions, put people on either you're on the side of Israel or you're on the side of Hamas. I wouldn't even say Palestinians. And it is we see the dehumanization of Israelis and Jews around the world as a result. I want to step away from the Holocaust now and move into the area of expertise that you have, and you talked about it just now about Poland. And I want to talk about the attitude of the Polish people, which would have contributed to the destruction of Polish Jewry. Could you tell us a bit about the period where and the role that Polish people played in the execution of the Holocaust.
Sure. So as Jews were edged out of Western European countries in a variety of ways, Poland really it wasn't Poland as a country, but the entity that we now think of as Poland was ruled by nobles. They were wealthy families that owned large swaths of land. They didn't want to develop the land on their own, and they had peasants living on this land. The peasants were largely illiterate. They were Christian peasants, and the nobles didn't want to actually go there and deal with their peasants to manage them. So at that point, they started inviting Jews, offering them greater rights than what they had in Western Europe, inviting them to become landlords of sorts. So the Jews would then lease the land from the nobles, and they would manage the peasants. The Jews would actually take on the economic risk. If they had a bad crop yield or whatever, the Jewish landlord would be, or the middleman would be responsible for it. And that's kind of how the economic structure rose up. So, with time, that resulted in more Jews that they didn't own land, but they were in positions like owning taverns, um, maybe banking in terms of lending money because they already had these structures. They had community institutions, things like that. And so they lived in a society with Poles, with Christian Poles, but they lived in such a way that Christian Poles really lived in villages. They lived kind of in the outside of small towns, whereas Jews lived in the inside, and they usually were the ones doing the trading. So the farming, the food might come from, the Polish peasants, and then they would trade for things like clothing, things like shoes, watches, whatever. They would come into town and they would have these market days. And so they had an economic relationship. Now, as when Poland became a state at the end of the First World War, it came out of the Versailles Treaty that the Allied powers imposed on Germany and Austria. Uh, Jews became citizens at that point, and as I said, the Poles were 60% of the population, and there were kind of two sides in the government structures, two ideas of what being a Pole meant. So, on the one side, you had a group of people that were saying being a Pole is being white, Christian, Catholic, ethnically Polish, speaking the Polish language. On the other side, there was a group that said, no, 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 we are a country of multiple ethnicities. Poles are only 60%. Aside from Poles, you have minorities that are Ukrainians, Jews, Belarusians, Russians, Germans. They had a German minority as well. All of these people need to be contributing citizens. So citizenship is based on citizenship. It's not based on ethnicity. And there was kind of a struggle in Poland back and forth over what that meant. Now, with changes in economic opportunities, more Christians moved into towns. There was, as farming and the agrarian opportunities were just not panning out because of various economic issues in Poland. Basically, Poland got squashed together and they had a whole bunch of different economic systems and they didn't really reconcile them. Plus, there was the Great Depression. There was increased resentment about toward Jews. So typically older people would say, yeah, I've done business with these Jews for a very long time. Younger people would say, well, no, I want to open up a shop. These Jews here have this shop. They've had it for generations. They have these business relationships. If I edge them out, if I say, with various anti-Semitic ideas floating around, if we say that Jews are less than, that they're not legitimately Polish, that they shouldn't be here, that they're taking away from us, if I get rid of the Jew, then maybe I'll be able to open up my shop and have the economic opportunity that I'm entitled to. Now, the issue was that, as I said, minorities were 40% of Poland at the time. So they were having these same issues with Jews, with Ukrainians, with Belarusians, with Germans. This was a whole situation in Poland in general. But part of it was because anti Semitism was becoming more and more common throughout Europe. Some of that rhetoric was moving in from Germany, was moving in from other places. And as I said, this gradual dehumanization, it's a slow creep. It becomes more and more acceptable to say certain things. It becomes more acceptable to do certain things. So, for instance, I have a friend who he's 98. He lives in Australia. He's from my hometown, and which is now Brest, Belarus, but it was Poland in the interwar period. He said that it became more acceptable in Catholic Mass, for instance, to say anti-Semitic things and to advocate for the boycott and the destruction of Jewish businesses. So Jews just got used to closing shutters on their windows, knowing that Catholics were coming out of Mass, because it would be totally acceptable for them to walk around and just break windows of Jewish businesses, Jewish shops. And the Jews got used to it, the Catholics got used to doing it. It was a slow creep. Now, the idea was not to kill all Jews. The idea was to push them out of Poland. For a variety of reasons, a lot of other countries closed their doors, and this is not just Poland. This was the situation in Austria, in Germany. This push to get Jews out, to get them to go elsewhere, so that the country will be ethnically homogenous. But other countries were not accepting Jews, so because they had nowhere to go, you had some pushback. You had political efforts by Jews in these various countries. Zionist movements rose up and they tried to push for rights, defend themselves, things like that. But as Hitler specifically started moving into more countries, annexing parts of Czechoslovakia, annexing Austria, well, Austria was first. He, when he invaded Poland, there wasn't much resistance. It wasn't because the Poles wanted him there. It's because their army was pretty weak and their response was weak. And Germany at that point was quite a terrifying military power. And they also didn't really adhere to the rules of war. So when they overran Poland, they saw Poles as pretty low on the ladder of their view of humanity in general, but they saw Jews as below them. And they really, Germans really, the Nazis specifically, they actually, they would flood areas with anti-Semitic slogans, newspapers, things like that. But then they would also incentivize people. So there was a food shortage. They would incentivize people to turn over Jews, to report on Jews, things like that, with money, with food, with alcohol. And so there were numerous motives for collaboration. But then Nazis also kind of took over the various structures that already existed in Poland, like the train system. And a lot of the Poles that became part of the system of destroying the Jews, it was very distant for them. They were behind a desk. They were seeing lists of people being deported to various areas, sent to camps, sent to resettled to different areas, and they kind of signed off on it, or they kept running the trains. They didn't offer resistance, and there are a variety of reasons for it. But if you also think about years and years of this rhetoric of groups of people being dehumanized, then you avert your eyes, especially when the rest of society is doing the same thing. And unfortunately, after the war, a lot of Poles were not happy to see the Jews return, whether that was from camps, whether that was from the Soviet Union. And in some cases, there were acts of violence that, you know, resulted sometimes because of these blood libels, because of these old stupid stories of Jews, stealing children for blood. But it was trigger events. There would be something that would upset the Polish population. They would become fearful of the Jews. And then there were other motivating factors. Maybe they took Jewish land, maybe they took houses, and they didn't want to give it back. And they themselves, perhaps had a bomb thrown onto their house in the midst of the war and lost everything. And so these acts of anti-Semitism, of violence, of just total antipathy toward your neighbor, they were motivated by a variety of factors, but that slow creep of dehumanization, it can't be ignored. And, in a lot of the newspapers from both the interwar period, from after the war, a lot of these acts of violence against Jews or anti-Jewish legislation, it was portrayed very much as the Jews deserved it. And it was it was because of an isolated incident, it was because of a suspicion, things like that. But when you see structures above you, the government, the newspapers, the people around you behaving in a certain way, and that's the way you're used to behaving, then you might not challenge it. And that's really something that where we are now, that dehumanization on either side, really. I mean, if Jews are dehumanized, if the conclusions are drawn too quickly about who is culpable for what, I've seen a great deal of people say, well, Israel is fully responsible for the violence that Hamas committed because of their difficulties with their Arab population, because of their policies toward Gaza. When you find it acceptable to justify terrorism, brutal violence, massacres, then that is dehumanization. It's that same slow creep, and other rhetoric becomes more and more acceptable. At the same time, the dehumanization of Arabs, of Muslims, it's the same. It's the other side of the coin. None of the dehumanization leads to any progress.
Vesta, that's really wonderfully put, and I like that you compared it to both sides as well, because I see, not really in Jewish circles, but I'm seeing from pro-Israel supporters with calls to wipe out all Palestinians. I mean, I've personally not seen it from any Jews, but I saw it, and it worries me that they are allowing the hatred of Hamas to affect them, and they're internalizing it as well, because Palestinian lives are important just as much as Israeli and Jewish lives are. Vesta, you really explained everything very well there. I want to switch things around a bit, and I want to introduce our audience to a word they may have never heard before. That word is pogrom. And I want to talk about how the pogroms would have led to the Holocaust, and also maybe if you could parallel, do you think pogroms can happen again today?
Sure. So pogroms, the people that know the word tend to associate it with violence in Russia. A lot of Jews especially in the U.S., there are a lot whose families arrived before the Holocaust, families that arrived in the early 20th century, and they always heard these stories of pogroms in Russia. And what happened there was that there was social upheaval. It was the same thing that I'm talking about, where there's social change, government structures are shifting. Maybe people are not fully trusting their government. Maybe they're not trusting their government's decisions. And there's a trigger event, which in this case, there was an assassination of a czar, of a leader of Russia. And people took it out on minority populations. In that case, it was pogroms. And what pogroms are they're acts of violence committed against a minority population, not necessarily a Jewish population. It's a minority population. The acts of violence are committed by the majority population, and they're committed against the minority on the basis of who they are. So the trigger event might be that something actually occurs. Maybe a Jew commits a crime. Maybe there is a suspicion that a Jew commits a crime. Maybe there's a suspicion that, for instance, with the Tsar, that a Jew was part of the assassination. Whatever it is, there's a trigger event, and then the violence occurs because the majority population is taking revenge. And one really important part of this is that typically the government structures, so the police and the army, they either aid and abet the violence, they might participate in it, or they just stand by. So basically, we as citizens, we expect to be protected by our governments, right? We expect that when we call the police, they're going to respond when, our house is being torn apart. In this case, that is not present. And so, when Jews were targeted, they were targeted by the majority populations, and the police forces or the army either participated or they didn't intercede to protect the Jews. And what, in some cases in the early 20th century, and especially around the 1920s, right after the First World War, there was a great deal of loss of life. Now, in the end of the interwar era, a lot of these pogroms really there weren't as many murders, there weren't as many Jews killed. The aim was often economic. So it was, for instance, in my hometown, and this is exactly what I'm writing about right now, there was a trigger event. There was a policeman came to a butcher and was seizing his meat, and this butcher's son became frustrated and stabbed the policeman. Obviously, that's a murder. Obviously, that's wrong. What ended up happening is that the Polish Catholic population of the town, which was equal to the Jewish population, at that point came up in arms and started destroying Jewish businesses. But not only did they destroy Jewish businesses, people came with wagons and actually looted. And the looting, the destruction of, economic property, things that have taken generations to build, that's a really vital component because remember, at that point, they were trying to edge the Jewish population out. So, what ended up happening in both the in around 1920 in the interwar era is that, as I had mentioned the word Zionism. Zionism is the idea that Jews should have a state. They should have a homeland in which they have a government structure in which they have protection. So that came up with in the later 19th century, this idea came up, but it really gained traction in situations in which Jews were more vulnerable. Because if you are not safe in the place where you live, if the government does not protect you from being killed, from having your property stolen, from being harassed, if the government is actually enacting laws against you, then the conclusion is that you should have a government of your own. You should have a place to go where you can seek safety and opportunity. And so Zionist groups really got their footing, even though they were present in the beginning of the 20th century after World War I. Especially in Poland, they were kind of a response to reduced religiosity and people looking for solutions to their life conditions, to being oppressed. And so they wanted to gradually emigrate to Palestine. Palestine at the time was under the British, it had been part of the Ottoman Empire until World War One, and it was on a British mandate at this point. The British were not allowing; they were only allowing a small trickle of people to enter Palestine. Conditions were really difficult. There was no infrastructure essentially. There was a ton of malaria, but these Jews were saying, okay, we need this place of our own. We a lot of them actually they created these farms outside of towns in order to learn how to farm, in order to learn how to live off the land. And their view was that they were going to coexist with the Arabs. They were going to live, and this is where kibbutzes, this is where they came from. They were supposed to be these sort of socialist little farms in which everybody performed some sort of activity, everybody fed into the pot, and everybody benefited from it. And this was the idea for developing Israel as a state, along with the Arab population. In the interwar period, there were a great deal of these little colonies. And they gave people something to believe in. They gave people something to look forward to and to hope for when they were facing these acts of violence. When they were not allowed to, for instance, go to medical school, they could say, well, eventually we'll build the state of Israel, we'll build this place where I'll be safe, and maybe I'll be able to go to medical school and be a doctor there and build into that society. In some cases, in the place where I was born, in Pinsk, there was a pogrom where it was the army. It was in 1919. The army actually killed 35 Jews who were just at a community center because they suspected them of collaborating with the Soviet Union, with the Bolsheviks. In that instance, this is a clearly an egregious massacre. And one of the Jewish responses was actually to found a kibbutz in Palestine. This was before the state of Israel. They founded a kibbutz to develop the land to farm, and it was in the name of these people that were killed. So not only was this an effort to be able to develop the infrastructure of the land to allow people to live on it, but it was also a way of memorializing, and and it was hope. It was a hope for a future. And so these pogroms, they certainly disturbed Jewish communities. They disempowered them. They robbed them. But at the same time, they had the secondary effect of causing them to see themselves as Jews within the society, to organize with their fellow Jews, and to look for a solution. And that solution was to have a homeland of their own in Palestine at the time. And as I said, there were a variety of ideas for that. Some of them were very, very, aimed toward coexistence with the Arabs. Some of the groups, it's not so much that they wanted to edge out the Arabs, but they saw the possibility of resistance, and they thought, well, we might have to protect ourselves. We've had to protect ourselves in this context. We might have to build an army. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what a pogrom is. Now, I have seen the word pogrom used for the massacre in Israel that occurred recently, and that's not quite accurate, because a pogrom is typically a situation where a majority population targets a minority population that's not being protected by the state. In this case, the Jewish people have a state. And the word pogrom is often used now, sort of with an ideological element of justifying why the Jewish people need to have a state. I wish that we were beyond that. I mean, Israel has been a state since 1948. It's going to be a state. There's no way that the Jewish population will suddenly leave. I think that calls for edging out the Jewish population, or actually, unfortunately, calls for genocide. So if we just shelve that, we don't. If we stop justifying the need for a Jewish state, the word pogrom becomes less relevant to this. I think in this case, because the population had their own government, they had laws, they had an army, they had police. It is not a pogrom, but the feeling of just rampant violence, of beheadings, of destruction, I think people are invoking this word because it feels very similar to past history. And the other way in which it's similar is that, when pogroms occurred, especially in the interwar period, generally speaking, it was the wording in the news, the narratives around it would be that the Jews provoked it. So as I said, there would be a trigger event. They would say the Jews provoked this violence. The Gentile population attacked them. There were some excesses. There was the minimization of destruction of Jewish life and destruction of Jewish property, but there was also the blame. And I think in this case, that's happening. Immediately after the massacre, although it was very well known that this was committed by Hamas, which is widely recognized throughout the world as a terrorist organization, there were so many people that just blatantly said that, Israel's responsible for this. Jews are responsible for this. This is thanks to colonization. And that is the same narrative that was occurring after pogroms in especially Polish anti-Semitic media that I have been reading. And then there's also the trigger events. The similarity that I see with the trigger events, it's like it's the coming to a quick conclusion over culpability in order to justify violence. And I saw that with the explosion at the hospital. That is obviously a devastating event. It's horrific. It's the destruction of civilian life. But even the New York Times, widely lauded, trusted news media immediately said that this was an Israeli strike. They have since issued an apology, but to say that without having the facts on the ground, without knowing who is actually responsible for the destruction, that creates a lot of emotion. And in this case, it spurred a great deal of very, very angry protests. And in some cases, embassies throughout the Middle East were targeted. And the reality was that, as intelligence now shows, it's IDF intelligence, it's American intelligence, Canadian, I believe. It was probably an errant rocket coming from a terrorist cell that just dropped. I saw a statistic that something like 25% of their rockets fail. And when those rockets fail and they're being shot from Gaza, think about how many of them are falling onto civilians. And the destruction of human life is horrific. Refugees are vulnerable. We need to be aware of that, and we need to send humanitarian aid and avoid the destruction of civilian life wherever possible. However, automatically blaming it on Israel, automatically blaming it on Jewish actions, I think that's harkening back to that same narrative of blaming the Jew and therefore stirring up anti-Semitism.
Right. Basically, it's the Jew is attacked, but the Jew is at fault for being attacked. As you
Yeah.
spoke, I could not help but in my mind, but especially at the beginning when you were talking about Poland and Europe, it was almost eerie. It was like it was today we're discussing today and what's happening in the media and what's happening in opinions around the world. So it's very relatable. It's not dusty history. It really comes to play that in our lives today. Vesta, I want to ask you something as a Holocaust educator, um, and a wonderful Holocaust educator you are. I'm sure all of viewers would agree. You've been so wonderful so far, and I'm sure you'll be wonderful till the end. But I'm sure you often hear, "I don't understand how average Germans could have allowed the Holocaust to happen." How do you answer that question? And how do you tie it in with the attitude of the average person today who sits by and either excuses away what Hamas does or says or does nothing?
I think it goes back to what I said about the slow creep of dehumanization. You know, when we choose to gradually allow certain wording to become normal, I think that inside of ourselves, I think again, back to social change, back to a personal anxieties. All of us have anxieties in our lives, whether those are economic anxieties, whether they're anxieties about not connecting with the younger generation. When we take those anxieties and place them on an outside object, which might be a group of people, it might be an idea, then I think that we have this tendency to sort of justify bigger things. So in this case, I think that, with Germany, with other countries, a lot of that anxiety was about change. There were political changes that people were not in agreement with. There were economic conditions. And it is easier to say, well, this is that person's fault. This is that group's fault, especially that group that's visible that wasn't visible before. If we get rid of them, we have a great deal more opportunity. It's easy to little by little buy into that. I was talking to a fellow scholar who's studying the development of truth and the development of what is truth to ourselves. And he was just saying, at protests, when you see a protest, people with their fist up saying something, calling out a rallying cry and repeating it to themselves over and over and over again, it's like they're willing a truth into existence. It's kind of like when we retell the story of a past event and we change it little by little by little, and then we kind of lose track of what was the truth in the beginning. We create our own truth, we create our own reality. And when we allow certain things to become acceptable in society, whether that's the way we word things, whether that's jumping to a conclusion, whether that's blaming, I think that we ourselves just simply get used to it. And it's difficult to upend our lives. It's difficult to blatantly say, well, this thing is wrong and um I'm going to do something about it. There are a lot of barriers to entry. But I think that we all have opportunities in small ways around us. And whether that's, hearing somebody say something racist or anti-Semitic, or dehumanizing any group, we should challenge that. We shouldn't just nod. That small challenge may cause that person to think, and it might cause them to realize, wait a second, this isn't acceptable. I shouldn't repeat this, and why am I saying it? And I think that in our case now, some of this idea of whether it's from the river to the sea in terms of what should be a Palestinian state, which speaks to the eradication of the Jewish people, or whether it's, pro-Israel people saying that all Palestinians are terrorists, it's not challenging those ideas, not seeing the humanity in a group of people, in painting people with a single brush, that the slow creep is gradually there. And I think the most important thing about that slow creep, about challenging it, is just looking out for it and being aware of it. If we don't allow ourselves to fall into it, if we challenge it, we don't allow people around us to fall into it, and it doesn't take hold. It doesn't become truth, in that same rallying cry sort of way. I think that is where we can learn something from the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is just a very visceral, massive, enormously painful example of what can happen.
Vesta, thanks so much. I do want to ask, since you are a Holocaust educator, and the Holocaust educator community is very tiny, and you mentioned that a Holocaust educator, Alex Danzig, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, I think it's Danzig, right? He was taken in to Gaza, he's been held, and also all other Holocaust survivors. And I think for Holocaust educators, Holocaust survivors are very precious to us. We know what they went through. You know their testimonies. How does it make you feel knowing that Holocaust survivors are kidnapped and currently in Gaza, we don't know alive or dead, and slash that Holocaust survivors were massacred on October 7th? And when I say, now I mean, how has we as a world feel these people? We feel them once before and we feel them once again. That's the way I've internalized it. I don't know if you could shed some thoughts on what I just said.
I mean, it's devastating. I actually, so I interview for the USC Shoah Visual History Archive, and that's a massive, massive, massive repository. It was started by Steven Spielberg. It's a massive repository of Holocaust and genocide testimonies in general. So, for instance, not only did they take Holocaust testimonies, they also look at Cambodia, Rwanda, other events, the war in Yugoslavia. And I think that each of those testimonies is precious because it's a story. And it's a story of not of only what went wrong, but of what went right. So it's a story of humanity and its darkness and its light. In it, I have an interview tomorrow with one, and he was in the Soviet Union. He's 93 years old. And one thing that he's holding, for instance, is he promised to sing me songs in Yiddish that his grandfather sang him. That's knowledge that with him, it will disappear. And I think that his story, is a story of two totalitarianisms, of running away from Nazi forces and going into the Soviet Union and starving there, of famines after the Second World War. His story is unique, and the value isn't just his story, it's what we can learn from the patterns. It's when we see these patterns of behavior, when we see these patterns of political trajectories, we can shine a light on them. But without the patterns, without the stories, we don't put the conclusions together. And I think, especially, the way that I was affected when I saw that the Holocaust educator, he's Polish. Poland has had a very, very fraught relationship to the Holocaust, and they just voted in a completely different government. And part of the past government's um, agenda was to use the Second World War, to use the Holocaust for nationalistic, ethno-nationalist aims. And I think people have, through education, they have gradually begun to see that as unacceptable. And I don't know for how many of them was that the basis of their voting, but they chose to edge this government out, right? And this government, it wasn't, I mean, their portrayal of the Holocaust wasn't the only issue. They, in general, minority rights were something that they had a horrible record with. And so this Holocaust educator, that's somebody that actually had an impact. He had an impact on somebody. The Holocaust survivors, I mean, it just tears it tears at the human conscience to think of them in their last moments in that context. A lot of these people hold incredibly painful stories and lessons, and to them, having been able to live a life, to continue a life, to have children, to have grandchildren, to live as Jews, that has been their massive, massive form of defiance. And, there's actually a friend of mine lives in Haifa, a fellow Holocaust scholar, and she told me that there's a Holocaust survivor there, a very very elderly lady who constantly goes out and protests the ways in which Palestinians are dehumanized in Israeli society. Now, Israel has a mixed record on this. It's a mixed bag. I won't go into it very much right now. But the thing is that this woman sees injustice in something, and she goes out and protests it. She's 90 something years old. And, there were people who were kidnapped, or people who were killed, who were people who actually attempted to work for Israeli Palestinian peace, who worked in humanitarian issues, who were medics. There were Arab, Muslim Israelis who were killed in this situation as well. And I think every time those lives are extinguished, we lose another opportunity for learning something, for action, for a contribution, and it's devastating.
Vesta, thanks so much. I want to end our conversation with one final thing. We had a conversation a couple of days ago where I asked you, probably from I was in a probably very sad place, but I asked you, is the slogan "Never Again"? Does it ring hollow now? And you shared a really wonderful response with me. I was hoping you could answer that question for our general viewers. Does "Never Again" have any meaning?
I mean, I think that Holocaust scholars often have mixed feelings toward this because we want to say never again. The genocide, the destruction of a group of people on the basis of who they are, that was defined and it was codified in international law after the Holocaust. This definition was spurred by the Holocaust. So we want to believe that creating this definition, creating laws, creating structures prevents these things from happening. Unfortunately, since then, there have been numerous genocides. Not to that magnitude, but still constant. And there is ethnic cleansing going on in the world today. So when you look at it from that standpoint, never again is disappointing for sure. At the same time, if we aim for it as a sort of North Star, it's more about, as I said, minimizing the damage, intervening as quickly as possible, seeing the patterns, and maybe stopping genocides before they happen. We will not always succeed. But if we don't learn the lessons, if we don't learn the patterns, if we don't rally against dehumanization, then what do we fall into? I was a fellow at the U.S. Holocaust Museum this summer, and "Never Again" is one of their slogans. And when I was buying merchandise, I kind of resisted the "never again" because as I said, I have such mixed feelings about it. But what I did buy was "What I Do Matters." And I think that when we see our actions as having value, as having relevance in this world, just like Holocaust survivors who give their testimonies, just like Holocaust educators, just like medics who might, work in these war zones, journalists who might report from these places, people who challenge what is truth in our world today, people who challenge problematic narratives. What we do matters, and it will matter toward at least, you know, not allowing dehumanization and violence to run wild. And I think that's really the important part That's the important lesson. So maybe not never again. Maybe it's a little bit of a false promise, although if we can see it as a North Star, I think it's valuable. But I think what I do matters. I think that is the slogan that I stick to.
Vesta, thank you so much for taking the time to speak, to educate all of us. It was a really illuminating conversation. You are an illuminating person overall. I hope for our viewers that they found meaning from this. Vesta, we will speak again very soon, and I thank you again for being on. And on behalf of Understanding Israel and the people in Trinidad and Tobago who view this, people from around the world who view this, I hope that this interview with Vesta gave you some meaning and clarification. Thank you, everyone. See you,
Thank you
Vesta.
so much.